The rain came down in sheets, turning the world outside his windows to a gray blur. Elias watched it from his chair by the cold hearth, the worn wood smooth beneath his palms. Rain like this was good for the late planting, but it had a way of seeping into the bones, a damp chill that reminded him of other colder nights, of emptiness. His life was a quiet collection of routines, measured by the turning of seasons and the needs of his land. He had his fields, his small flock of sheep, the sturdy stone house his grandfather had built. It was enough. It had to be. A flicker of movement at the edge of his property, down by the main gate, snagged his attention. It was hard to see through the deluge, a smudge of darker color against the washed-out green of the pasture. Probably a deer or a stray wolf driven down from the ridges by the storm. He watched for a moment longer, his brow furrowed. The shape was too large for a wolf, too deliberate for a deer. It was humanoid. He stood, the old joints in his knees complaining. He was not a young man, and the years of farm work had settled deep into his frame. He pulled on his heavy oilskin cloak, the fabric stiff and smelling of wax and wood smoke. He did not reach for the axe by the door. Not yet. Trouble rarely came knocking so politely, even in a storm. More often it smashed the door down. As he trudged down the muddy path, the wind whipped the rain into his face, cold as needles. The shape resolved itself. He stopped, his hand tightening on the wooden gate. It was an orc, a female, tall, broad-shouldered, clad in scraps of leather and what looked like broken pieces of iron plate armor. A wicked-looking blade, chipped and dark with what he prayed was mud, was strapped to her back. Green skin, a strong jaw, small tusks jutting from her lower lip. She was everything the stories warned about. A savage, a killer. But she was not alone. Huddled against her legs, half hidden by her tattered cloak, were two children. Small orcs, no older than 5 or 6 summers, their faces pale with cold and fear. They stared at him with wide, dark eyes that seemed too large for their faces. The female's posture was not threatening. It was exhausted. A deep, bleeding gash ran down her arm, the rain washing the blood away in thin, pink streams. She held herself like a cornered animal that had no fight left. She met his gaze, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the sigh of the wind through the pines. He could see the tremor in her hands, the slight slump of her shoulders that spoke of utter depletion. Then she spoke. Her voice was a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together, but it was stripped of all aggression. It was raw, and it was pleading. "We have no one left, sir." His mind screamed at him. No, absolutely not. This was how men like him died. A moment of pity, an open door, a blade in the back. Orcs were war and ruin, the embodiment of everything that had already taken so much from the world, from him. He should turn around, bar the door, and let the storm have them. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But his eyes kept drifting to the children, their small, shivering forms, the way they pressed against their mother's legs, as if trying to merge with her, to disappear. They were not warriors. They were not savages. They were just cold, frightened children. He remembered another child, another rainy night, a memory he kept locked away in the deepest, most fortified part of his heart. He remembered a small hand in his, growing cold. Damn it all. With a heavy sigh that seemed to pull the weight of the world down on his shoulders, Elias pulled back the heavy wooden bolt on the gate. The groan of the iron hinge was the sound of his quiet, predictable life breaking. "The barn," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "It's dry and warm." He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the large, dark shape of the barn, his back to them. It was the most foolish and vulnerable thing he had done in 20 years. Every step was an invitation for that chipped blade to find a home between his shoulder blades. He kept walking, his gait even, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He heard the squelch of heavy boots in the mud behind him. 3 sets of footsteps, one heavy, 2 light. They followed. He slid open the huge barn door, the familiar scent of hay, animals, and earth rolling out to meet them. It was dark inside, but dry. He led them to an empty stall, clean and deep with fresh straw. His milk cow, Daisy, watched them with placid brown eyes from the next stall over. "Here," he grunted, gesturing. The York female herded her children into the corner, then turned to face him. She stood between him and them, a wounded, weary guardian. Her eyes, the color of dark amber, swept the barn, cataloging every tool, every shadow, every exit. She was still a warrior, even on the verge of collapse. "Why?" she asked. The single word was laced with a thick layer of suspicion. Elias shrugged, avoiding her gaze. He looked at the children, who were now huddled together in the straw, their fear a palpable thing in the air. "They're cold," he said, as if that explained everything. "Stay here. I'll bring something." He left them, sliding the barn door mostly shut, leaving a small gap for air. Back in the house, the silence felt different. Accusatory. He had invited the wolf into the fold. He stoked the embers in the hearth, adding fresh logs until a small fire crackled to life. He filled the pot with water and put it on a heat, his movements automatic. He gathered what he had: old blankets, thick and scratchy but warm, a heel of bread, a wedge of hard cheese. He found his medical supplies: a small box containing clean linen, a needle, gut thread, and a pot of foul-smelling herbal salve for sealing wounds. He hesitated, then added a flask of cheap, fiery brandy. For the pain, or the cold, or the courage. He was not sure which. When he returned to the barn, she was exactly where he had left her, standing sentinel. The children had fallen into an exhausted sleep, curled together like puppies. He set the items down just inside the door, a good 10 feet away from her. "The water is for the wound," he said, nodding toward her arm. "The rest is food." Blankets. He did not look at her. He looked at the sleeping children. "It's all I have." He turned to leave. "Wait." He stopped, his back still to her. "No one gives shelter to my kind," she said, her voice flat. "Not for nothing. What is your price?" Elias felt a flash of irritation, sharp and unexpected. He turned slowly to face her. The firelight from the house cast long shadows, making the barn a place of secrets. Clear's throat. "Lady," he said, his own voice sounding tired and thin. "If I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this. There's no price. Clean your wound before it goes bad. Eat the food. Get some sleep." He paused, his gaze dropping to the gash on her arm. "That cut needs stitching." She followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I can tend to my own wounds." "Can you?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "It's on your sword arm. You won't be able to pull the stitches tight enough with one hand." Her jaw tightened. He was right, and they both knew it. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the warrior's pride warring with a mother's practicality. If she was crippled, she could not protect her children. He sighed again, a sound of pure resignation. "Look, let me see it. If you don't like what I'm doing, you have a blade. I'm an old farmer. I imagine you could kill me before I manage a single wrong move." He expected her to refuse, to threaten him. Instead, after a long, tense silence, she gave a stiff, jerky nod. "Just once." Slowly, cautiously, he approached. He knelt in the straw, leaving the medical supplies between them. "Let's see it, then." She unwrapped the crude binding she had tied around it. The wound was worse than he thought. A clean, deep slice through muscle, sluggishly oozing blood. It was a sword cut. She had been in a fight. Recently. He worked in silence, his hands steady and sure from a lifetime of mending animals and his own frequent injuries. He cleaned the wound with the hot water, her skin surprisingly warm to the touch. She did not flinch, though he saw the muscles in her jaw bunched tightly. He took the brandy. "This will burn," he warned. "Do it." He poured a little of the spirit into the wound. She let out a sharp hiss through her teeth, her whole body going rigid, but she made no other sound. He took the needle and thread, his movements economical. He was a farmer, not a surgeon, but he knew how to sew a straight line. He stitched the angry green flesh together, each pass of the needle a strange, intimate act. He was acutely aware of her stillness, of the power coiled in her frame, held in check by sheer will. He could feel her watching his every move, her breath warm on his hands. When he was done, He smeared the thick, dark salve over the stitches and wrapped it all in clean linen. "It'll scar," he said, his voice low, "but it should heal clean if you don't tear it open." He sat back on his heels. The job was done. The air in the barn was thick with unspoken things. She looked down at his handiwork, then back up at his face. Her amber eyes were searching, trying to decipher him. He could not imagine what she saw. A tired old man with dirt under his nails and sadness in his eyes. "My thanks," she said. The words sounded foreign on her tongue, as if she had not had cause to use them in a long time. "Just rest," he said, getting to his feet. He picked up the now empty water pot and turned to go. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who was hunting her. He did not want to know. Knowing was a burden, and he already carried more than his share. The next morning, the rain had stopped. A watery sun was trying to break through the clouds. Elias went about his chores with a new, thrumming awareness of the occupants in his barn. He milked Daisy, fed the chickens, checked the fences. All the while, he expected to find the stall empty, the orcs having slipped away in the pre-dawn gloom. But they were still there. When he entered the barn, the mother was awake, sitting with her back against the wall. Her blade was laid across her lap. The children were awake too, chewing silently on the last of the bread and cheese he had left. They watched him with the same unnerving stillness as their mother. He nodded a curt greeting and went about his work, forking hay into the stalls, his movements practiced and deliberate. He tried to ignore them, to treat this day like any other. But it was impossible. Their presence was a stone dropped into the placid pond of his life. He worked for an hour, the only sound a rustle of hay and the soft lowing of the cow. When he was done, he noticed something. The handle of his favorite wood axe, which had been splintering for weeks, was now wrapped tightly with strips of cured leather, the binding intricate and strong. It was her work. He saw her glance at the axe, then quickly away. It was a silent form of payment. A message. "I'm not a beggar." He picked it up. The grip was perfect, better than he could have done himself. He looked at her, and she met his gaze this time, a flicker of something, pride perhaps, in her eyes. He just nodded. Good work. A routine began to form over the next few days, a fragile, unspoken truce. He would work his farm, and she would watch. He never entered their stall without announcing himself, and she never ventured into the house. He brought them food twice a day, simple stews, fresh bread, milk from the cow. He never sat with them. He would leave the bowls by the stall door and retreat. But small things began to change. One afternoon, he was struggling to rehang a heavy gate that had come off its hinges. It was a two-man job, and he was trying to prop it up with a piece of scrap wood, grunting with the effort. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. The orc female was there. Without a word, she took hold of the other end of the gate and lifted it as if it weighed nothing. She held it steady while he fumbled with the iron pins, his fingers clumsy under her silent gaze. When he was done, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thank you," he mumbled. She just grunted in response, a sound that was not quite dismissal and not quite acknowledgement, and returned to the barn. Her children started to emerge from their shell of silence. The boy, the older of the two, began to follow him at a distance as he did his chores. He never spoke, but he watched Elias's hands with intense concentration as he mended a fence or sharpened a tool. The girl, smaller and shyer, would sometimes leave a single wildflower on the stump where Elias left their food bowls. A tiny, vibrant splash of purple against the weathered gray wood. One evening, as he brought their meal, he found the mother honing her massive blade with a smooth, dark stone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was a strangely calming sound. The children were using a smaller, duller knife to carve figures into a piece of scrap wood. They were a family, he realized. A broken, fugitive family, but a family nonetheless. He set the bowls down. This time, he hesitated. The fire in the house was lit, and the loneliness of his solitary meal suddenly felt heavier than usual. "The stew is hot," he said, speaking to the floor. "It's better when it's hot." He left, not expecting anything. But a few minutes later, as he sat at his own small table, he heard the soft creak of the barn door. He looked up to see the orc female, standing in the doorway of his house. She held the 2 empty bowls in one hand. Her children were right behind her, peering around her legs. She stepped inside, placed the bowls on his table, and then stood there, uncertain. It was the first time she had crossed that threshold. An invitation hung in the air, unspoken. "There's more," he said quietly, gesturing with his spoon toward the pot on the hearth. She retrieved the pot and filled their bowls again, then herded her children to the far side of the hearth, where they sat on the floor. She did not sit herself. She stood, leaning against the stone chimney, and ate. They shared the small, warm room in a silence that was no longer entirely uncomfortable. It was companionable. Later that night, after they had returned to the barn, Elias sat by the dying fire. He found himself talking, his voice a low murmur in the quiet house. He did not know if he was talking to himself or to the ghosts that haunted the corners of the room. "My wife, she loved the wildflowers in the spring," he whispered. "Yellow ones. My daughter, Anna, she used to pick them. We had a small patch right by the creek." He stopped, his throat tight. He had not said their names aloud in years. The fever took them. Same winter. He fell silent, the weight of the confession settling around him. He had not meant to say it. The words had just come out. The next evening, they shared the meal in his house again. The silence was deep, but charged. As the children dozed by the fire, the orc female spoke, her voice a low rumble. "My mate was Borgid's brother," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "Borg had craved the clan leadership. He saw my mate as a rival. He saw my son as a future threat. She did not need to say more. Betrayal. Murder. A flight in the night. It was an old, ugly story, one that crossed all species, all borders. My son's name is Kale," she added, her gaze softening as she looked at the sleeping boy. "My daughter is Lyra." She paused, then looked directly at Elias. "I'm Gorza." Elias nodded slowly. "Gorza. It was a strong name, a warrior's name." "I'm Elias," he said. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was something, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of fear and mistrust. That night, as he banked the fire, he found a small, perfectly carved wooden bird on the mantelpiece. Kale's work. He picked it up, the wood smooth and warm in his palm. He went to bed feeling a little less alone. It was a foolish feeling. The world had a way of punishing such foolishness. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Elias was checking his snares at the edge of the woods when he found it. A track, a single, clear boot print in a patch of damp earth. It was huge, heavy, and cleated with iron. Orc-made. It was fresh. His blood ran cold. He was a farmer, but he knew how to read the land. One print meant a scout, and where there was one scout, more would follow. They had been found. He backed away slowly, erasing the track with a fallen branch, and hurried back to the farm, his heart hammering against his ribs. The peace of the past week had been a lie, a brief calm in the eye of storm. He found Gorza in the barn, teaching Kale how to properly hold a knife, guiding his small hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes immediately narrowing at the look on his face. She knew. "They're here," he said, his voice tight. "A scout. Found a track in the woods." Gorza's face became a mask of cold stone. All the softness of the past few days vanished, replaced by the hardened steel of the warrior. She rose to her feet in a single, fluid motion, her hand going to the hilt of her blade. "How close?" "Eastwood line. A day old, maybe less. They will send a small party first," she said, her mind already working, calculating. To test. To confirm, she looked around the barn, then at the house. Her gaze was clinical, assessing defenses, sight lines, weaknesses. "This place is not defensible." "I know," Elias said. "It's a farm, not a fortress." "We should run," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. She glanced at her children. Lyra had started to cry softly, sensing the shift in the air. Running was what had brought them here, exhausted and wounded. They could not run much farther. "No," Elias said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "Not yet. You said it yourself. A small party. A test," he thought for a moment, his farmer's mind seeing the land not as a battlefield, but as a network of paths, ditches, and familiar terrain. The creek bed, north of the pasture. It's deep, overgrown. They'll use it for cover to get close to the house. Gorza looked at him, a new kind of respect in her eyes. He was not a warrior, but he knew his land. An ambush, she stated. They won't be expecting it, Elias said. They'll be expecting a terrified farmer and a wounded fugitive. They'll be arrogant. They made their plan quickly, in low, urgent tones. It was a desperate gamble. Gorza would be the hammer. Elias, and his knowledge of the farm, would be the anvil. He would create a diversion, draw them in. She would do the rest. He felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He was a man who mended fences and delivered lambs. What was he doing planning an ambush against orc warriors? But then he looked at Kale and Lyra, their small faces etched with terror, and the knot of fear hardened into something else. Resolve. They waited. The afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. Elias went about his evening chores, his movements deliberately slow and normal. He fed the sheep, his ears straining for any unnatural sound. The world seemed too quiet, too still. As twilight bled into the sky, he saw them. 3 large shapes, moving swiftly and silently along the tree line, just as he had predicted. They dropped into the deep, shadowy creek bed that would lead them, unseen, to the back of his house. It was time. Stay with the children, Gorza commanded, her voice a low growl. Keep them in the barn, or the door, no matter what you hear. Elias shook his head. That wasn't the plan. The plan has changed, she snapped. This is not your fight. This is my home, he countered, his voice steady. They are on my land. It is my fight. He held her gaze, and for the first time, he did not feel like an old, tired farmer. He felt like a man defending his own. I'll draw them out. You be ready. Before she could argue, he turned and walked out of the barn, carrying a lantern. He did not light it yet. He moved through the deepening shadows to the back of the house, his heart a frantic drum. He could hear them now, the soft crunch of their boots on the gravel of the creek bed. They were close. He took a deep breath and then did the stupidest thing he could imagine. He lit the lantern, the sudden flare of light making him a perfect target. He held it up and called out, his voice shaking only slightly. Who's there? Silence. Then a low, guttural laugh from the darkness. 3 figures rose from the creek bed, their silhouettes massive against the dying light. They were huge, bigger than Gorza, and armed with heavy, cruel-looking axes. The farmer. One of them sneered in the common tongue, his voice thick with contempt. We're looking for a stray dog. A female. With pups. Have you seen her? I don't know what you're talking about, Elias said, holding the lantern steady. His hand was slick with sweat. This is my land. You need to leave. The lead orc laughed again. Your land? He took a step forward, his friends fanning out to flank him. This land belongs to the strong. And you, little man, are not strong. He was toying with him, drawing it out. They were confident, overconfident, exactly as Elias had hoped. She is property of War Chief Borghad. The orc continued, advancing slowly. Give her to us, and we will let you live. I told you, Elias said, backing away toward the corner of the house, toward the spot they had chosen. I don't know who you're. He never finished the sentence. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadow of the barn's eaves. It was Gorza. She moved with a speed and silence that was terrifying, her blade a whisper of steel in the air. The orc on the right went down before he even knew she was there, her sword shearing through the leather and muscle of his neck. He fell with a wet, gurgling sigh. The other 2 spun around, shock on their broad faces. The leader roared in fury and charged, swinging his heavy axe in a wide, clumsy arc. Gorza sidestepped the blow with fluid grace, the axe head burying itself in the wall of the house. As he struggled to free it, she drove the tip of her own blade up under his arm, deep into his heart. He gasped, his eyes wide with surprise, and slid to the ground. The third orc, seeing his companions fall in seconds, hesitated. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by raw fear. He took a half step back, his eyes darting between Gorza and the darkness. That was when Elias acted. He threw the lantern. It arced through the air and smashed against the orc's chest, spilling burning oil down his front. He screamed, a high, terrified sound, and dropped his axe, beating at the flames that engulfed his tunic. He was no longer a warrior. He was just a creature in pain. Gorza dispatched him with a single, merciful thrust. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the dying flames on the orc's body and Elias's own ragged breathing. It was over. It had taken less than a minute. Gorza stood over the last body, her chest heaving. She looked at Elias, her eyes gleaming in the dusk. He had not run. He had held his ground. He had thrown the lantern. Then she looked down at the dead orc leader. Her face hardened. She knelt and roughly pulled back the collar of his tunic. There, tattooed on his neck, was a sigil, a snarling wolf's head split by a jagged axe. The mark of Borghad. He called you the property of War Chief Borghad, Elias said, his voice quiet. He was finally piecing it together. The deference, the immediate assumption of leadership. She wasn't just a refugee. Gorza looked up from the body, her expression grim. She finally seemed to see the cost of this victory. The splintered wood of the house where the axe had struck. The dark stains seeping into the earth of his farm. The end of his peace. My name, she said, her voice heavy with a truth she could no longer hide, is Gorza Grokarog. And I am no one's property. She paused, the weight of her next words filling the space between them. I was the mate of the Karag chieftain. Borghad is his brother. And now, he is the usurper. Chieftain, usurper. These were words of power, of war, of politics. Words that had no place in his simple life. He felt a cold dread wash over him, colder than the night air. He had not sheltered a refugee. He had sheltered deposed royalty. He had not taken in a desperate mother. He had taken sides in a war for a throne. He looked at her, at the bodies bleeding out onto his land, at the damage to his home. He felt a surge of anger, sharp and bitter. It was the anger of a man who had been used. You lied to me, he said, his voice flat. I survived, she corrected him, her voice like iron. I did what I had to do to protect my children. I would do it again. By bringing your war to my doorstep, he shot back, his voice rising. My home? This is all I have left. Do you think I wanted this? She countered, gesturing at the carnage. To be hunted? To beg for shelter from a human farmer. The insult was plain, an old reflex from a life of command. These three were just scouts. They won't have been sent alone. When they don't return, Borghad will send the rest. He will not send 3. He will send 30, or more. The number hit him like a physical blow. 30, an army. They would tear his farm apart, burn it to the ground, and salt the earth. For a moment, all he could feel was a profound, aching sense of betrayal. Their quiet meals, the shared silence, the carved bird. Had it all been a lie? A calculated manipulation to secure a hiding place. You should have told me, he said, the anger draining away, leaving only a hollow ache. You should have told me what I was risking. Gorza's stony expression softened for a fraction of a second. He saw a flash of something in her eyes. Regret. If I had, she said quietly, would you have opened the gate? He did not have an answer for that. They dragged the bodies into the woods, a grim, silent task. They had to move fast. There was no time for recriminations. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a certainty bearing down on them with the rising of the moon. When they returned to the barn, Kale and Lyra were huddled in the straw, their eyes wide with fear. They had heard everything. Kale ran to his mother, burying his face in her leg. Lyra, however, looked at Elias. She walked slowly toward him and, with a trembling hand, pushed the little carved bird he had left on the mantelpiece back into his palm. A small, desperate offering. A plea. He closed his hand around it. His anger dissolved, replaced by a terrible, weary sadness. It did not matter if he had been lied to. It did not matter that his life was about to be destroyed. These children were still just children. Their mother was still just a mother, doing whatever it took to keep them alive. He will come at dawn, Gorza said, her voice low and strained. He will want to make an example of me, and of anyone who helped me. The implication was clear. He could still run. He could take what little he valued and disappear into the night. Let them face their fate alone. It would be the smart thing to do. He looked at the smoking gash in the side of his house, at the dark patches on the ground, at the terrified faces of the children, at Gorza, who stood tall and defiant even in the face of annihilation. He thought of his quiet, empty life, the long, silent evenings, the hollow space where his own family used to be. Running would be smart. It would also be empty. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I will not run from my own home." He looked her in the eye. "We will face them. Here." For the first time since he had met her, Gorza looked truly surprised. She searched his face, looking for a lie, for fear, for some hidden angle. She found none. She found only a stubborn old man who had drawn a line in the dirt. "You are a farmer," she said, not as an insult, but as a statement of fact. "You have no armor. You have no skill with a blade." "I have this," he said, gesturing to the farm around them, "and I know every inch of it." And so they prepared for war. The night was a frenzy of activity. Under Gorza's direction, they turned the farm into a death trap. He showed her the weak points in the barn walls, the loose floorboards in the loft. They overturned the heavy watering trough, creating a barricade. They dug pits and filled them with sharpened stakes, covering them with loose hay. He brought out every tool he owned that had an edge or a point: sickles, scythes, pitchforks. They were peasant weapons, but they were better than nothing. As they worked, a strange sense of calm settled over him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his gut, but it was overlaid with a sense of purpose he had not felt in decades. He was no longer just enduring. He was fighting. Just before dawn, they were finished. The farm was quiet again, but it was a waiting quiet, taut and deadly. They gathered in the house for a last moment of stillness. Gorza strapped her children into a small, hidden cellar beneath the floorboards, a place Elias had once used for storing potatoes. "Do not make a sound," she commanded them, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "No matter what, I will come for you." She closed the heavy trapdoor over them, her face a mask of grief. Then she turned to Elias. She was wearing her battered armor. Her sword was sharp. She was a queen going to war for her children. She held out a short, heavy-bladed axe to him. "You know how to use this." He took it. The weight felt strange and terrible in his hands. "I've split wood with one," he said. "Good enough," she said. "Stay close. Do not break formation." They stood by the window, watching the eastern sky turn from black to gray. And then they saw them, a column of dark figures marching out of the woods. Not 3, at least 30. An iron tide coming to wash his world away. At their head was a massive orc in ornate, black iron plate, a huge double-headed axe resting on his shoulder. Warhead. He marched right up to the gate and stopped, his war band spreading out to surround the property. He stared at the house, his expression one of pure arrogance. "Gorza!" he bellowed, his voice a roar that shook the morning air. "You have run far enough. Come out and face your chieftain. Bring me the whelps, and I will grant you a warrior's death." He spat on the ground. "As for your human pet, he will die screaming." Elias felt a tremor of fear run through him. Gorza placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm as stone. "Courage, farmer," she murmured. The first wave of orcs charged, roaring. They came for the front door, expecting an easy fight. They found a barricade of furniture and a determined farmer with a wood axe. Elias swung wildly, the axe biting into the wood of the doorframe, into the arm of the first orc to try and push through. The battle for the farmhouse was a blur of chaos, noise, and terror. Gorza was a whirlwind of steel, her blade a flickering arc of death. She moved with a brutal efficiency that was both beautiful and horrifying to behold. Elias fought with the desperate strength of a cornered man. He was not a warrior. He was clumsy. He was slow, but he was stubborn. He used his knowledge of the house, kicking over tables to trip them, using the narrow hallway as a choke point. They were driven back from the house, but the cost was high. The windows were shattered, the door was splintered, and Elias had a deep cut on his forearm. They retreated to the barn, the second line of their defense. Borghad, enraged by the resistance, sent his warriors forward again. But they were funneled toward the barn doors, right into the traps Elias and Gorza had set. Orcs fell into the hidden pits, impaling themselves on the sharpened stakes. They stumbled into tripwires made of vine, and Gorza cut them down as they fell. But there were too many. They swarmed the barn, their numbers overwhelming. A flaming arrow thudded into the dry hay of the loft, and the whole structure began to go up in smoke and flame. They were cornered. The barn was burning around them, the heat and smoke choking them. Elias's arm throbbed, and his lungs burned. Gorza had taken a blow to the leg and was limping, her movements losing their fluid grace. Through the smoke, he could see Borghad, watching, a cruel smile on his face. He was enjoying this. This was the end. He had made his stand, and he had failed. His home was burning, and they were about to die. But Gorza was not done. She pushed him back toward a small, reinforced door at the rear of the barn that led into the sheep pen. "Go," she ordered. "I'm not leaving you," he yelled over the roar of the fire. "That is an order," she roared back, the chieftain in her voice silencing all argument. But then her tone changed, became something else. Urgent, pleading. "Elias, the children, they will need someone." She turned to face the oncoming orcs, her sword held ready. A last, hopeless stand. And then, from the woods, came a sound. A deep, resonant blast from a war horn. Everyone froze. Borgid's head snapped up. From the west, from the direction of the high mountain passes, a new force of orcs was charging into the valley. They were not Borgids. They carried a different banner, a gray mountain peak on a field of black. They fell upon the rear of Borgid's war band with savage fury. Loyalists, Gorza's people, they had come. Borghad roared in frustration and rage, his prize about to be snatched away. He turned his furious gaze back to the burning barn. He would not be denied his vengeance. He charged forward, straight for Gorza, his massive axe raised. Gorza met his charge, her blade clashing against his axe with a scream of tortured metal. The duel of the chieftains began amidst the fire and chaos. It was a brutal, desperate dance. Borghad had size and strength. Gorza had speed and skill, but she was wounded and exhausted. Elias watched, helpless, as she was driven back, step by step. Borghad battered her defenses, his axe blows like hammer strikes. He knocked her sword aside and kicked her wounded leg, sending her sprawling to the ground. He stood over her, his axe raised for the final blow. Elias did not think. He acted. He let out a yell and charged, swinging his simple wood axe with all his might. He was no match for the war chief, and he knew it. But he might buy her a second. Borghad, distracted by the yell, turned his head. It was only for an instant, but it was enough. Gorza, lying on the ground, drove her blade up, plunging it deep into the unarmored joint behind his knee. He howled in agony, his leg buckling. As he stumbled, Elias's axe, swung with a farmer's strength, slammed into the side of his head. It was not a warrior's clean blow. It was a clumsy, brutal chop like splitting a log. Borg had crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror ended by a farmer's axe. Silence. The Loyalists were finishing off the last of Borgid's routed forces. The barn burned. Elias stood over the body of the dead war chief, his knuckles white on the handle of his axe, shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Gorza pushed herself to her feet, leaning heavily on her sword. She looked at Borgid's body, then at Elias. Her face was unreadable, covered in soot and blood. The leader of the Loyalists, a grizzled old orc with a scarred face, ran up to her and dropped to one knee. "Chieftain," he said, his voice thick with reverence. "We came as soon as we heard." Gorza ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Elias. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her gaze sweeping over the ruins of his farm, his life. Then she looked back at him. The man who had sheltered her, tended her wounds, and stood with her against an army. She limped toward him. In front of the remaining warriors of two clans, she stopped before him. She was the victor, the rightful chieftain. He was just a human, an outsider, a tool that had served its purpose. But that is not what she saw. "Elias," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet. It was not the voice of a refugee, but of a queen. "You have lost your home in my war. Your lands are ash." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "I cannot give you back what you have lost, but I can give you a new home, a new life." She held out her hand, not her sword hand, her other hand. It was an offer. "Come with us," she said. "Come with me. I will name you consort of the Karag clan. You will have a place of honor at my side. You and your skills will be valued. You will be protected." The loyalist warriors stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. A human? Consort to their chieftain? It was unthinkable. Elias looked at her offer hand. He looked at the smoking ruins of his house, the barn collapsing into a pit of fire. Everything he had ever known was gone. He had nothing left here but ghosts. He could take her offer, a life of safety, of honor, protected by her power. He would be a pet, a treasured possession. He met her eyes. He saw the genuine gratitude there, but also the ingrained assumption of her status, her power over him. He did not take her hand. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. A murmur went through the orcs. Gorza's eyes widened slightly, the first hint of hurt showing through the warrior's mask. "I will not be your consort, to be protected," Elias continued, his voice gaining strength. "I will not stand behind you." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I will stand with you, beside you, as a partner, or not at all." He was an old farmer, covered in dirt and blood, holding a wood axe. He was giving terms to a warrior queen. It was the most audacious thing he had ever done. For a long moment, Gorza just stared at him. He saw a storm of emotions in her eyes: shock, anger, pride, and something else, something that looked like awe. She was being challenged, not by a rival for power, but by a man demanding to be seen as an equal. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. It transformed her harsh features into something beautiful. She let her hand fall, then took his, not in a gesture of leadership, but in a clasp of equals. Her grip was strong and warm. "Then stand with me, Elias," she said, "as my partner." And in front of all her people, she sealed the vow. The departure was somber. Elias retrieved Kale and Lyra from the cellar. They ran to their mother, but their eyes were on him. He was the man who had stood with her. He walked through the ashes of his house one last time, retrieving only one thing: the small, carved wooden bird. He tucked it safely into his pocket. The journey to the Karag stronghold in the mountains was long and arduous. Elias was an object of intense curiosity and suspicion among the orcs. They were a hard people, forged by a hard land. They valued strength above all, and they could not understand what their chieftain saw in this soft-skinned, slow-moving human. But Gorza's word was law. He was given a place by her side, and none dared challenge it openly. He faced their scorn with the same quiet stoicism he had faced his lonely life. He did not try to be an orc. He did not pick up a sword. He remained what he was: a farmer, a builder, a craftsman. He saw the struggles of their mountain home. Their small patches of high-altitude farmland were inefficient. Their tools were crude. Their understanding of animal husbandry was basic. So he went to work. He redesigned their terrace fields, showing them how to better use the sun and water. He built a simple aqueduct system from a mountain spring, a concept that was utterly foreign to them. He helped the clan smith forge better plowshares, stronger hinges, more efficient axe heads. He taught them crop rotation. He showed them how to build warmer, drier shelters for their livestock. He did not command. He worked. He showed them with his hands, with his quiet, patient knowledge. Slowly, grudgingly, respect began to grow. They saw that his strength was not in the swing of an axe, but in the turn of a screw, the line of a wall, the yield of a harvest. He was making their lives better. He was making the clan stronger. One evening, a year after they had left the ashes of his farm, Gorza summoned him to her chambers. She was preparing for a clan council meeting. She stood before a mirror, trying to fasten the complex straps of her ceremonial armor. He came up behind her, his movements now familiar and welcome in this space. He took the leather straps from her hands and began to buckle them into place. It was a mirror of their first, tense encounter in his barn when he had stitched her wound. Now, there was no tension, only a comfortable, practiced intimacy. Her eyes met his in the reflection. "The elders are pleased," she said. "The harvest was the best in a generation. The winter stores are full for the first time in memory." "The land is good," he said simply, his fingers working the last buckle. It just needed to be understood. She turned to face him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "It was not the land, Elias. It was you." She looked at him, truly seeing him, not as a human, or a farmer, or a consort, but as her partner, her strength. "They see it now. They see your worth." He had spent a lifetime feeling invisible, a man defined by what he had lost. Here, in this unlikely place, among this fierce people, he had finally been found. He had lost a home, but he had found a purpose. He had found a family. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, worn wooden bird. He placed it in her hand. "We built something new," he said. She closed her hand around it, her grip as strong and sure as the day she had first taken his hand amidst the ruins of his old life. "Yes," she said, her voice soft. "We did.